The iron collar bit into Samuel's neck as he stood perfectly still in the Louisiana sugar mill, watching Jacques Rousseau demonstrate his newest invention, a speaking tube system that carried the overseer's commands to every corner of the plantation. What Rousseau didn't know was that for 6 months, Samuel had been learning the acoustic properties of those very pipes, and by dawn, the overseer's own voice would become the instrument of his downfall. The morning would bring confusion, liberation, and a silence that would haunt Rousseau for the rest of his days. The Mississippi Delta, humidity clung to everything in the summer of 1847, making even breathing feel like an act of defiance on the Bell Fountain plantation. The sugar cane stretched toward the horizon like an endless green prison, and somewhere within those fields, 300 enslaved souls labored under a sun that showed no mercy. Samuel Baptiste was 32 years old that summer, born into bondage on this very land, his entire existence defined by the rhythms of harvest and the crack of the overseer's whip. Among those 300 souls, Samuel possessed a gift that most dismissed as peculiar, occasionally useful, but ultimately inconsequential. He had an extraordinary sensitivity to sound that allowed him to distinguish conversations from hundreds of yards away, identify people by their footsteps alone, and mimic voices with such precision that even family members could be fooled. As a child, Samuel had entertained other slaves by reproducing the calls of mockingbirds with perfect accuracy, switching seamlessly between the songs of different species until listeners couldn't tell bird from boy. His mother, Esther, had recognized early that Samuel's gift was both blessing and curse. In a world where any distinction could prove dangerous, being different meant attracting attention from people who viewed slaves as interchangeable units of labor. She had warned him repeatedly to hide his talent, to become as invisible and ordinary as possible. But Samuel couldn't help listening to everything around him. The whisper of wind through cane stalks that told him when storms approached, the rhythm of hammers in the blacksmith shop that revealed which tools were being repaired, the distant conversations of Master Belfountain's family on their veranda that provided insights into the household's dynamics and future plans. Samuel learned to use his gift carefully, sharing what he overheard only with trusted friends, always framing his knowledge as lucky guesses or fortunate coincidences rather than the product of acoustic surveillance. He became known as someone who seemed to know things without explanation, a reputation that made him valuable to the slave community without attracting dangerous scrutiny from the white overseers. People would come to Samuel with questions. When would the next work rotation happen? Which overseer was in a foul mood? Whether the master was planning to sell anyone? And Samuel would provide answers that proved eerily accurate. The relatively stable order of Belfountain Plantation changed dramatically when Jacques Rousseau arrived in the spring of 1845. Master Belfountain had brought him in from New Orleans specifically for his reputation as an innovator in plantation management. Rousseau wasn't satisfied with traditional methods of control that relied on physical presence and brutal punishment. He believed in systems, efficiency, and the application of modern technology to what he called the scientific management of human resources. His ideas had been published in agricultural journals, and wealthy planters throughout the South followed his recommendations for maximizing productivity while minimizing the costs associated with slave mortality and resistance. Rousseau was a lean man in his early 40s with sharp features and calculating gray eyes that seemed to be constantly measuring, evaluating, and finding everything slightly deficient. He spoke with a Creole-accented French that reflected his New Orleans upbringing, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he had solved problems that had vexed lesser minds. Where other overseers relied on intimidation and violence, Rousseau preferred psychological manipulation and systematic control. He studied the slaves under his management like a naturalist observing insects, identifying patterns of behavior that could be exploited or modified to serve the plantation's interests. Within weeks of his arrival, Rousseau began implementing changes that transformed daily life at Belfountain. He introduced detailed record-keeping systems that tracked each slave's productivity, health, and behavior with bureaucratic precision. He reorganized work crews to maximize efficiency, separating families and friends to prevent the formation of solidarity networks that might enable resistance. Most controversially, he announced plans to install a technological innovation that he claimed would revolutionize plantation management, a speaking tube system that would allow him to communicate instantly with any location on the property. The speaking tube network took 8 months to install, requiring the labor of specialized craftsmen from New Orleans who worked alongside plantation blacksmiths to create and position hundreds of feet of copper piping. The system's design was ingenious in its conception, tubes running underground and through buildings, converging on a central hub in Rousseau's quarters where he could select specific destinations for his communications. The main chamber contained a large amplification device that magnified Rousseau's voice before sending it through the selected tube, ensuring his words would emerge clearly even at distant locations. Rousseau had installed output points throughout the plantation. In the sugar processing mill, where the roar of machinery normally made verbal communication difficult. In the stables where horse handlers needed instruction. At various points throughout the cane fields where work crews labored. In the slave quarters where announcements could reach everyone simultaneously. And even at the punishment posts where disobedient slaves were displayed as warnings to others. Each output point was marked with a brass plate engraved with Rousseau's initials, a constant reminder of who controlled the voice that emerged from the pipes. The psychological impact of Rousseau's invention exceeded even his ambitious expectations. Slaves working in remote fields would suddenly hear the overseer's voice materializing from a copper pipe, issuing commands or corrections that seemed to prove he possessed supernatural awareness of their activities. People in the quarters would be awakened by Rousseau's amplified voice announcing inspections or work assignments, the sound appearing to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The speaking tubes made Rousseau omnipresent in a way that physical presence never could, and the uncertainty about whether he was actually nearby or simply projecting his voice created constant anxiety throughout the plantation. Samuel had watched the installation of the speaking tube system with intense interest, though he was careful to hide the depth of his fascination. He recognized immediately that Rousseau's invention was not just a communication tool, but an instrument of psychological warfare designed to maintain perpetual surveillance and control. The tubes transformed Rousseau from a single overseer who could only be in one place at a time into an omniscient presence who might be listening or speaking from any location at any moment. The effect on plantation morale was devastating. People worked faster, spoke more cautiously, and abandoned any thoughts of resistance when the overseer's voice could materialize anywhere without warning. Rousseau's recognition of Samuel's acoustic sensitivity led to an assignment that would prove fateful. The overseer needed someone to maintain the speaking tube system, checking for obstructions, cleaning the pipes, and ensuring optimal acoustic quality throughout the network. Most slaves lacked the technical aptitude or interest for such work, but Rousseau had noticed Samuel's uncanny ability to identify problems by sound alone. During a demonstration, Samuel had correctly diagnosed a partial blockage in a tube simply by listening to the quality of transmission, impressing Rousseau enough to assign him permanent responsibility for system maintenance. The position gave Samuel unprecedented access to the speaking tube network and intimate knowledge of how it functioned. His maintenance duties required him to enter Rousseau's quarters regularly to inspect the central hub, to crawl through cramped spaces checking underground pipe sections, and to spend hours at various junction points throughout the plantation testing acoustic quality. Rousseau assumed this knowledge was harmless in the hands of someone he considered intellectually inferior, incapable of understanding the system's full implications or potential applications beyond basic maintenance. But Samuel understood far more than Rousseau imagined. His extraordinary acoustic sensitivity allowed him to perceive things the inventor himself had missed. During his maintenance work, Samuel discovered that the speaking tubes didn't just carry sound in one direction from Rousseau's central chamber to output points throughout the plantation. The pipes also transmitted voices back to the central hub through acoustic resonance and the physical properties of interconnected copper tubes. Rousseau's office was essentially a sophisticated listening post that could eavesdrop on conversations anywhere the tubes extended, though the overseer seemed completely unaware of this unintended capability. Samuel learned to position himself at junction points in the tube network where multiple pipes converged, locations where he could hear conversations from several areas simultaneously. The acoustic properties of the copper pipes actually amplified and clarified sounds in ways that exceeded even his natural abilities. Over months of careful listening, he assembled a comprehensive understanding of plantation operations, security procedures, guard rotations, and the personal dynamics among the white staff. He knew which guards were drunk on duty when Master Bellefontaine traveled to New Orleans for business, how Rousseau coordinated patrols to prevent escapes, and even intimate details about the overseer's own fears and insecurities. The intelligence Samuel gathered through the speaking tubes revealed vulnerabilities in plantation security that nobody else recognized. He learned that guard patrols followed predictable patterns, that certain areas went unmonitored during shift changes, and that the white overseers frequently contradicted each other's orders due to poor coordination. Most importantly, he discovered that everyone, from Master Bellefontaine to the lowliest guard, had developed complete dependence on Rousseau's speaking tube system for communication. The plantation had restructured itself around this technology, abandoning older methods of direct supervision and physical message delivery in favor of Rousseau's innovative network. Samuel's acoustic gift also allowed him to master perhaps the most dangerous skill he would ever develop: perfect vocal mimicry of Rousseau himself. The overseer's distinctive Creole-accented voice, with its particular inflections and authoritative tone, could be reproduced so precisely that even people who knew Rousseau well couldn't distinguish Samuel's imitation from the original. Samuel practiced this mimicry in absolute secrecy, whispering into the tubes during nighttime maintenance sessions, adjusting his voice until the copper pipes carried sounds identical to Rousseau's commands. The catalyst for Samuel's plan came on a scorching afternoon in July 1847, when Rousseau used the speaking tubes to orchestrate a public punishment that demonstrated the full horror of his systematic approach to control. A young woman named Clara had been caught teaching several children to read using a discarded newspaper she'd found near the main house. Literacy among slaves was illegal throughout Louisiana, and Rousseau viewed Clara's actions as a direct challenge to the order he had worked so hard to establish on Bellefontaine Plantation. Rather than simply punishing Clara privately, Rousseau decided to make her an example that would reinforce his authority and discourage similar resistance. He used the speaking tube system to summon the entire plantation population to the main yard, his voice echoing from every output point simultaneously with a command that nobody could ignore or claim not to have heard. 300 people assembled in the brutal afternoon heat, while guards forced Clara to a punishment post at the center of the yard. What followed was a demonstration of Rousseau's psychological sophistication in the application of terror. He didn't simply have Clara whipped while the crowd watched. He narrated the entire punishment through his speaking tube system, his amplified voice providing a running commentary on her crimes, their implications for plantation order, and the consequences that awaited anyone who followed her example. The voice came from multiple locations simultaneously, creating a surround sound effect that made Rousseau's presence feel inescapable and overwhelming. 30 lashes were administered while Rousseau's voice counted each one with clinical detachment, explaining between blows how Clara's desire to educate children threatened the natural order that kept the plantation functioning efficiently. The amplification made every word clear despite Clara's screams, and the multiple output points meant that nobody could escape hearing Rousseau's lecture no matter where they stood in the yard. Samuel was forced to watch along with everyone else, listening to Rousseau's voice distort with amplification, hearing the satisfaction in the overseer's tone as he demonstrated the totality of his control. That night, as Clara lay in the slave quarters crying from pain and humiliation while others tried to comfort her, Samuel made his decision. The speaking tubes that Rousseau wielded as instruments of terror would become weapons against him. Samuel's gift for mimicry, combined with his knowledge of the system's mechanics and his months of acoustic surveillance would allow him to turn the overseer's own voice into an agent of chaos and liberation. The plan that began forming in Samuel's mind was audacious to the point of seeming impossible, but he had learned that the most effective resistance often involved using oppressors' tools against them in ways they never anticipated. The plan required months of preparation and absolute secrecy. Samuel began by creating detailed maps of the entire speaking tube network, memorizing every junction point, output location, and the acoustic properties of different pipe sections. He discovered that by speaking into specific tubes at particular volumes, he could make his voice emerge from any location while disguising its origin point. More importantly, he learned that the acoustics of the copper pipes helped disguise any imperfections in his vocal mimicry. When Rousseau's voice came through the tubes, people heard what they expected to hear rather than questioning subtle inconsistencies. Samuel's practice sessions took place in the deepest hours of night, when he could test his vocal abilities without risk of being overheard by anyone except the tubes themselves. He would whisper into pipes, adjusting his voice until it matched Rousseau's distinctive accent and tone perfectly. He practiced the overseer's common phrases and commands, learning to reproduce not just the words, but the authority and expectation of obedience that made Rousseau's communications so effective. The copper tubes became Samuel's secret training ground, the place where he transformed his natural gift into a precision weapon. The next phase involved identifying allies without revealing the full scope of his plan, a necessary precaution because the risk of betrayal was ever present in a community where desperate people sometimes purchase small advantages by informing on their fellow slaves. Samuel approached Marie, an older woman who had worked in the main house for decades and had access to Master Bellefontain's schedule and correspondence. He also recruited Thomas, the plantation's head blacksmith whose shop contained a tube junction that could prove crucial for Samuel's purposes. Neither ally knew the complete plan, only that Samuel needed specific information and their silence about his unusual questions regarding the speaking tube system. Marie proved invaluable in providing intelligence about the White family's activities and plans. Through her position in the main house, she could access Master Bellefontain's calendar and overhear conversations about upcoming trips and business dealings. Samuel learned from her that the master would be traveling to New Orleans for 2 weeks in October to negotiate new credit arrangements with his bankers, an absence that would leave Rousseau in complete control of the plantation without higher authority to question unusual occurrences or investigate confusion among the staff. Thomas's contribution came through his technical knowledge and his ability to provide explanations for Samuel's modifications to the speaking tube system. When Samuel needed to create small acoustic chambers at strategic junction points, modifications that would enhance his ability to project his voice while masking its true origin, Thomas helped by claiming these alterations were necessary maintenance to improve overall system performance. The chambers were so minor that Rousseau never noticed them during his inspections, but they gave Samuel crucial capabilities for the coming operation. During this preparation period, Samuel also began carefully observing the schedules and habits of the white overseers who assisted Rousseau in managing the plantation. He learned which men were reliable and which were frequently drunk, when shift changes created temporary gaps in supervision, and how the overseers communicated with each other and with Rousseau. Most importantly, he identified that despite Rousseau's systematic approach to plantation management, actual coordination between overseers remained poor. They relied so heavily on receiving orders through the speaking tubes that they rarely communicated directly or developed independent understanding of overall security plans. Samuel's plan crystallized around a deceptively simple concept. He would use Rousseau's voice to issue contradictory commands that would create chaos and confusion among the plantation's security forces, then exploit the resulting disorder to orchestrate an escape not just for himself, but for dozens of others who were ready to risk everything for freedom. The speaking tubes that had made Rousseau seemingly omnipresent would make him appear incompetent, erratic, and ultimately absent when his actual voice tried to restore order. The system's greatest strength, its ability to project authority from a single source to multiple locations, would become its fatal weakness when that source of authority could be perfectly counterfeited. The technical execution of the plan required Samuel to understand not just how to mimic Rousseau's voice, but also how to manipulate the speaking tube network to create maximum confusion while minimizing the risk of detection. He identified specific tube junctions where he could input commands that would emerge from multiple output points simultaneously, creating the impression that Rousseau was issuing contradictory orders from his central chamber rather than someone else manipulating the system. He also mapped out the timing required to move between junction points quickly enough to maintain the illusion of centralized command while actually operating from distributed locations throughout the plantation. Samuel's preparation also included creating specific escape routes for the people he planned to liberate, identifying paths through the sugarcane fields that would provide cover while leading toward swamp areas where pursuit would be difficult. He used his maintenance access to the speaking tube network to eavesdrop on conversations about patrol patterns and slave-catching techniques, gaining intelligence that would help escapees avoid the most dangerous obstacles. Every piece of information was filed away in Samuel's remarkable memory, building toward a comprehensive plan that addressed dozens of variables and contingencies. As October approached and Master Bellefontaine prepared for his trip to New Orleans, Samuel began the delicate process of identifying which slaves would participate in the escape attempt. This election required careful judgment. He needed people who were desperate enough to risk death for freedom, but disciplined enough to follow instructions and maintain silence about the plan. Samuel chose mostly young adults without children, reasoning that parents would be reluctant to abandon their offspring and that children would make the escape group more vulnerable to recapture. The chosen night arrived with unseasonable fog rolling across the delta, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards and creating acoustic conditions that would enhance Samuel's vocal manipulations. Master Bellefontaine had departed for New Orleans 2 days earlier, and Samuel had verified through Marie that Rousseau's assistant overseers, Paul and Jean-Baptiste, were drunk in their shared quarters near the main house, having celebrated the master's departure with smuggled whiskey. The remaining guards followed predictable patrol patterns that Samuel had memorized through months of observation. All elements of the plan had aligned as well as could be hoped. Samuel began his operation at midnight, speaking into a tube junction near the slave quarters in Rousseau's voice, commanding the night guards to report immediately to the main gate for an emergency inspection of security procedures. The guards complied without hesitation. After all, Rousseau's voice carried absolute authority, and the speaking tube system had never been compromised before. The overseer's commands were law, and questioning them was unthinkable for men who had been conditioned to instant obedience through years of systematic reinforcement. While the guards assembled at the main gate, expecting Rousseau to arrive for the promised inspection, Samuel moved to a different tube junction and used Rousseau's voice to summon them back to the quarters to investigate a reported theft of tools from the blacksmith shop. The contradictory command created immediate confusion. Which order had been issued first? Which should take priority? The guards hesitated, argued among themselves, and eventually split into two groups, with some remaining at the gate while others hurried back toward the quarters, each group certain they were following the overseer's authentic instructions. As guards rushed back and forth responding to contradictory orders, Samuel escalated the chaos systematically. He used Rousseau's voice to announce through the tubes leading to the slave quarters that all slaves must remain in their quarters under threat of severe punishment, then immediately contradicted himself by ordering work crews to report to the sugar mill for an emergency overnight processing session. The result was paralysis among both slaves and guards, with nobody certain which commands were legitimate and which were somehow mistaken or superseded by more recent orders. The confusion spread as Samuel issued more contradictory commands through different tube junctions. Rousseau's voice ordered guards to check the northern fields for escaped slaves while simultaneously commanding them to remain at their posts under no circumstances. The voice announced that Master Bellefontaine was returning early from New Orleans and required an immediate inspection of the entire property, then moments later declared that all personnel should remain in their current positions to avoid interfering with a special audit of plantation operations. Rousseau himself emerged from his quarters around 1 in the morning, awakened by the commotion and confused by reports of contradictory orders being issued in his voice. But when he tried to countermand the false instructions and restore order, his actual voice now competed with Samuel's perfect imitation coming from multiple tube junctions throughout the plantation. The psychological advantage of the speaking tube system had been completely inverted. People no longer knew which voice to trust, whether to obey the commands coming from the tubes or the overseers shouting at them in person. The genius of Samuel's approach lay in how it exploited the plantation's dependence on Rousseau's technological system. For 2 years, guards and overseers had been conditioned to obey the voice that came through the speaking tubes without question, accepting it as authentic and authoritative. Now, when confronted with multiple versions of that voice issuing contradictory commands, they lacked any framework for determining which was genuine. Their training had made them efficient followers of a centralized command system, but it had also eliminated their capacity for independent judgment about the authenticity of commands. Samuel used this chaos to guide his chosen group toward the escape routes he had identified during months of careful planning. Speaking through tubes that led to specific locations, he issued commands in Rousseau's voice directing guards away from the paths that escapees would use. He sent patrols to investigate fictitious disturbances on the opposite side of the plantation, while dozens of people slipped into the swamps under cover of fog and acoustic misdirection. The escapees moved in small groups following Samuel's whispered instructions, taking advantage of gaps in coverage that Samuel had created through his manipulation of the guard force. The masterpiece of Samuel's plan came in the pre-dawn hours when he began mimicking not just Rousseau's voice, but also those of Master Bellefontaine, Paul, and Jean-Baptiste. The acoustic properties of the speaking tubes made these impersonations convincing enough to create the impression of a multi-layered conspiracy or catastrophic communication breakdown at the highest levels of plantation management. Guards received orders they believed came from the master himself, countermanding Rousseau's authority and creating a crisis of command that paralyzed the plantation's security apparatus. By dawn, 73 slaves had disappeared into the Louisiana swamps, following routes to underground railroad contacts that Samuel had learned about through months of acoustic surveillance via the speaking tube network. The escapees included Clara, whose punishment had catalyzed Samuel's plan, along with Marie, Thomas, and dozens of others who had waited years for an opportunity like this. Samuel had organized them into small groups with leaders who knew the general direction to travel, creating a distributed escape structure that would be difficult to track or intercept. Rousseau found himself unable to organize an effective pursuit because his own voice, or what everyone believed was his voice, continued issuing contradictory commands that prevented coordinated action. Guards who tried to follow the escapees' trails were called back by tube commands claiming new priorities. Patrols that assembled for organized pursuit were disbanded by orders to investigate emergencies in other areas. The overseer's sophisticated control system had become a weapon of mass confusion. Its psychological effectiveness now turned against the very authority it had been designed to reinforce. The sun rose over Bellefontaine Plantation to reveal a scene of complete chaos. Rousseau stood in the main yard, hoarse from shouting commands that nobody seemed to trust or follow consistently. Guards milled about in confusion, uncertain about their duties or how to respond to the situation. The slave quarters were half empty, with dozens of people simply vanished into the swamps during the night's confusion. The speaking tube system, Rousseau's pride and technological triumph, had become a source of disorder rather than control, its copper pipes now carrying nothing but silence and uncertainty. When Master Bellefontaine returned from New Orleans a week later, summoned by urgent messages about the disaster that had befallen his plantation, he found Rousseau's reputation in ruins. The overseer's explanations about his voice being mimicked through the speaking tube system sounded like the desperate excuses of someone trying to avoid responsibility for catastrophic incompetence. The master's investigation revealed that 73 slaves had escaped, an unprecedented loss representing tens of thousands of dollars in property value, and that recovery efforts had been hampered by continued confusion and contradictory commands that had paralyzed security operations for nearly 2 days. The aftermath of Samuel's escape would reshape how plantations throughout Louisiana approached technological control systems. Rousseau's speaking tubes were dismantled not just at Bellefontaine, but at several other plantations that had installed similar systems based on his recommendations. The incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-reliance on technological solutions to management challenges, and about the unforeseen vulnerabilities that complex systems could create. Insurance companies began refusing to provide coverage for plantations that used speaking tube networks, considering them security liabilities rather than assets. The story spread through slave communities across the South with remarkable speed, carried by the Underground Railroad's communication networks, and embellished with each retelling. It became a legend whispered in quarters and fields from Louisiana to Virginia. The tale of the man who stole the master's voice and used it to orchestrate the largest single escape in Louisiana history. The story took on mythological qualities, with some versions claiming Samuel could mimic any voice he heard, while others suggested he possessed supernatural powers that allowed him to confuse and misdirect white authorities. Samuel reached safety at an Underground Railroad station in Mississippi within a week of the escape, guided by contacts he had learned about through his acoustic surveillance. The journey north took him through Tennessee and Kentucky, following established routes that carried him steadily away from the dangers of recapture. At each station, he found operators who had already heard accounts of the Bellefontaine escape, and who treated him with the respect accorded to someone who had struck a significant blow against the slave system. The final stage of Samuel's journey brought him to Ohio, and then across Lake Erie into Canada, where he joined a community of escaped slaves who had found genuine freedom beyond the reach of American slave catchers. Samuel settled in a town called Chatham, where his gift for voices found new purpose in the theater companies that served the settlement's diverse population. He performed in productions that used drama to educate people about slavery and to raise funds for the Underground Railroad operations that continued helping others escape bondage. Samuel never forgot the people he had left behind in Louisiana, and he remained active in abolitionist circles throughout his life in Canada. He provided detailed information about Bellefontaine Plantation's operations to Underground Railroad conductors, helping them plan additional rescue operations in the region. He spoke publicly about his experiences whenever such testimony might advance the cause of ending slavery, though he was always careful to avoid details that might help slave catchers develop countermeasures against acoustic manipulation techniques. The speaking tube system that had seemed so innovative in 1845 became a symbol of slavery's fundamental weakness. The institution's dependence on technology and systematic control created vulnerabilities that intelligent resistance could exploit. Samuel's success in turning Rousseau's greatest innovation against him demonstrated that oppressive systems contained inherent contradictions and weak points that careful observation could identify and leverage. The lesson spread through resistance networks, inspiring similar operations that used masters' tools and systems against them in creative and unexpected ways. Rousseau himself never recovered from the disaster that had destroyed his reputation as an innovator in plantation management. Master Bellefontaine dismissed him within months of the mass escape, and no other plantation would hire someone whose technological systems had been so comprehensively compromised. Rousseau eventually left Louisiana for Texas, where his past was less well known, but the story followed him. He died in 1852, reportedly still haunted by the memory of hearing his own voice issuing commands he had never given, orchestrating chaos he was powerless to prevent. The plantation itself declined in the years following the escape, never recovering the economic losses or restoring the psychological control that Rousseau's system had provided before Samuel turned it against its creator. Master Bellefontaine sold Bellefontaine to creditors in 1849, and the property changed hands several times before the Civil War finally ended the institution of slavery that had defined its purpose. The copper-speaking tubes were eventually salvaged for scrap metal, melted down, and reformed into objects that served freedom rather than bondage. Samuel lived into old age in Canada, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew freedom as their birthright rather than a dream to be pursued at terrible risk. He often reflected on the night he had crept through Bellefontaine Plantation, speaking in Rousseau's voice, orchestrating chaos and liberation through copper pipes that were meant to reinforce authority, but had instead become instruments of resistance. He never regretted his actions, though he acknowledged the moral complexity of using deception and manipulation to achieve justice. In his later years, Samuel became a mentor to younger activists who were organizing against slavery through both legal and extralegal means. He taught them about the importance of patience, careful observation, and understanding the systems they sought to challenge. His experiences had convinced him that resistance required not just courage, but also intelligence and strategic thinking. The willingness to study oppression carefully enough to identify its weaknesses and the discipline to prepare thoroughly before acting. The story of Samuel Baptiste and the speaking tubes became part of the larger narrative of slave resistance that historians would later document as central to slavery's ultimate defeat. While dramatic revolts and violent confrontations received more attention in contemporary accounts, stories like Samuel's demonstrated the sophistication and creativity that characterized much of the resistance that occurred within slavery's constraints. His use of acoustic manipulation represented a form of psychological warfare that anticipated techniques that would be developed more formally in later conflicts. The 73 people who escaped with Samuel's help during that foggy October night represented a significant victory in the broader struggle against slavery. Most reached freedom in the North or Canada, where they built new lives and contributed to the communities that had welcomed them. Their stories, combined with Samuel's, provided powerful testimony about the effectiveness of careful planning, technical knowledge, and strategic exploitation of oppressors' own systems against them. Jacques Rousseau's speaking tubes have been designed to make an overseer omnipresent, to create surveillance and control that would prevent resistance by making escape seem impossible. Instead, those same tubes became the instrument through which Samuel demonstrated that no system of oppression was truly impregnable, that intelligence and determination could turn technology against those who wielded it. The copper pipes that were meant to carry commands instead carried liberation, proof that even the most sophisticated tools of control contained the seeds of their own defeat when confronted with human creativity and courage. The fog lifted from the Louisiana Delta on that October morning in 1847, revealing empty quarters and confused guards, but also revealed a fundamental truth about the nature of resistance. Samuel Baptiste had proven that even within the most oppressive systems, individuals could find ways to fight back when they possessed the knowledge, skills, and determination necessary to turn the master's weapons against them. The overseer's voice had orchestrated chaos and liberation through copper pipes designed for control, and the echoes of that night would continue resonating through the decades that followed, inspiring others to find their own ways to challenge injustice and pursue freedom.